We'd just like to remind you to please keep this a civil discussion. We are here not to attack, but to share and come to solutions. So panelists, as you go, if you would each take a brief moment to introduce yourself, and then you'll have 5 minutes. Our moderators will be keeping track of your time.
All right, I'll go ahead first because I think my name was on the list first. I'm Dr. Christopher Terry. I'm a professor of psychology here at Elmira College. Some of you know me, but it's great to see some new faces, and happy to be part of this panel and take some questions as we move along through the session. I will keep my anecdotes brief, but I want to share 2 anecdotes and maybe try to squeeze in a little bit of academic information in the middle that comes from my health psychology class, since this panel is focused on physical and mental well-being during the climate crisis. So just as real as climate change is climate anxiety. It can cause a lot of stress, anxiety, even lead to despair about what the future may look like if we don't take further action and change what is happening with the climate. And so one anecdote that brought me a lot of inspiration recently was my 7-year-old son, who's in 2nd grade, who presented at the Torn and Painted Post Science Fair just this past weekend. And he expressed interest in it. He likes science. So I started suggesting ideas like doing something about the solar system and the planets. Nope, he had other ideas, all of his own, and it was about renewable energy. And he wanted to focus on wind power specifically. And I really wanted to do this cool, solar system display. He had ideas that were much more focused on solving problems, not just on, hey, isn't the solar system? So that was a big source of inspiration. And from his initiative, I got, involved in helping with a project about wind power, and I learned some things. So that was very inspiring. And it's instances like that if we focus on those, we can shift more from hopefully anxiety or the road to despair toward a road that's much more optimistic and filled with hope, because there is so much going on that is giving us the power to move in a positive direction and change the climate back to a path that is going to be healthy for ourselves and for the planet. We often talk about pessimism versus optimism. This comes up in my health psychology class. I see a few folks from health psychology here. And if we think of that not as a feeling, oh, I feel pessimistic or I feel optimistic, but as a way of thinking, a pattern of interpreting events, we can shift ourselves from a state of pessimism to optimism. If when something bad or discouraging happens, we don't think then, well, this is just an example of how everything's wrong and it's always going to be that way. All those global and stable attributions. We shift more to, no, this is one specific instance. It's a specific problem that I can solve, and it's temporary. If we break climate change down into lots of specific problems that could be temporary because we can change them, they'll become much more manageable. And that'll lead us in a more optimistic direction. The last anecdote I'll share just briefly is a present that Santa Claus brought me back in December, which was a book after I heard an interview on a podcast with the not climatologist, but primatologist, Jane Goodall, who's also been an environmental advocate. She's coming up, I think on her 90th birthday soon, I believe. She is still out there spreading hope, and she published a book recently based on a series of interviews with the writer Doug Abrams called The Book of Hope. And I mentioned that to my wife when she got the word to Santa Claus, said, yeah, I really think I probably need to read that book. I could use more sources of hope. And I did find it very inspiring. And so I recommend that. She has a lot of sources of hope that she continues to find very late in her life. And much of it comes from looking at the younger generation and how much action they are taking on a day-to-day basis. So I'll turn it over to our next panel.
My name is Kent Bushman. None of you know me. I live up in the Adirondacks and I direct a youth camp up there. I want to start with a story. 2 people are walking together down a street in New York City, and there's taxis going on, and what do you get off the street, and jackhammers going. And the one woman turns to her friend. She says, "Did you hear that?" And the friend goes, "What?" She said, "I think I heard a cricket." And he goes, "No." And there's all this noise going on. And they walk over, and there's one of those trees that they plant in pots in New York City, and underneath the leaf, sure enough, there was a cricket. And her friend turns to her and says, "That's amazing. How did you hear the cricket? You must have supersonic hearing." And she said, no, watch. She reached in her pocket. She pulled out some change and she threw it on the sidewalk. And everybody in about 20 feet turned to see where that money was that dropped down. And she said, see, it's just a matter of what you're listening for. Picking up on the good professor here, there's a lot of anxiety. I can wake up most mornings and feel like, yeah, we're screwed. The planet is screwed, because that's how I often feel. But I can't act on that alone. I have to, and I would suggest we all have to rewire ourselves to listen to things a little bit differently. David Sobel in his little thesis Beyond Ecophobia talks about having 3 characteristics: having empathy, having exploration, and having social justice as part of our wiring to act in this world. There was a forester in Senegal in the 1960s. Forester worked on the green movement over there. His name was Baba Dione, and he wrote, we will conserve only what we love love only what we know, and we will know only what we're taught. And often with the climate issues, we start with we got to solve these problems now. And I want to suggest that most of our life we need to spend learning empathy and learning how to love and learning how to be present. So in the short time, I'll give you 5 things that you can do to go home with. One is don't complain about the weather. It's never a bad day. As the Danes would say, it's just bad clothing, all right? Weather is not climate. If you wake up and thinking it's raining, it's a bad day, you're already off to the wrong start to the day. Each day is a gift. So where is the gift in what you have in that day? The second thing is celebrate the seasons. My family, my little story is that the most important day of the year for my family, and I'm a minister, by the way, the most important day is the winter solstice. It's the darkest day of the year because we gather together and we celebrate that we're still here on the darkest day of the year. I have other friends who celebrate the equinox. Do you know why we have Groundhog's Day when it is? Groundhog's Day is a cross-quarter day. It's halfway between the solstice and the equinox. Find things to celebrate because you don't only live in a place, you live in a time. And once you begin to get into the rhythms of the time, you'll find that things are happening around you that are worth paying attention to, that are worth preserving, that are worth loving. Hang a world map somewhere in your house. I saw that on Sleepless in Seattle, and we always had a world map up in our house. I pulled it down the other day to find out where Senegal was because I wasn't sure where Baba Dione was from. I pulled it down because I want to know where Lviv is, and I want to know what's around it that is being bombed. Find yourself in the world, that this is a big place. Don't just stick to your Google Maps. Expand on that. Finally, actively care for something because your life isn't about you. It's a plant, it's a dog, it's something outside of you. And lastly, find something every day to go, wow. On the way down, we stopped, got out of the car, and I turned to my daughter and said, "Is that a red-winged blackbird?" She said, "Yeah. Red-winged blackbirds come back in the spring." And that was my wow moment. So start to rewire yourself around this issue. So that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Aeryn Fulton. I'm a professor over at LECOM, at Microbiology and Immunology, Internal Medicine. And, sort of bouncing off of the idea of finding something to believe in, it's really interesting. I was originally going to talk about how as climate changes and it gets warmer, we're going to have more tropical diseases coming north. And to a large extent, that's actually a historical thing, like yellow fever, malaria, those were in the United States prior to our epidemiologists and public health managing to push them out. So it's almost like we're returning to an innate state. But I don't think most of you are old enough to remember this, but there used to be commercials with Sally Struthers. And she used to say, for the price of a cup of coffee a day, you could feed this family of X number, and then they will write you letters. And it used to make me feel really kind of weird because I thought that was creepy. Because why don't they just help the kid there? But the reality is that price of a cup of coffee a day is what is going to be required for total climate equity. Like, imagine for a moment your family having to survive off of what could be purchased for the price of a cup of coffee. If we disseminate it out equally, That's where we're going to be. Your social media will disappear as power is rationed. And that's going to happen. But don't despair. I mean, we are capable of tremendous feats of physical and mental prowess under extremis, in extremis. And I think we're going to have to rediscover that the hard way. And when it comes to something to believe in, we've sort of bought into this scientific method, materialist, empiricist vision of the universe that has cut us off from the metaphysical, God, if you will. We evolved to have temporal lobes and amygdalae that allow us to conceive of gods and the metaphysical. It's part of the hardwiring, the operating system of what we are. In fact, I think there's anecdotal evidence, well, not anecdotal, I think there's actual literature out there that suggests that people who have a belief, a fundamental belief in a higher power have lower all-cause mortality than people who do not, just because of the power of the placebo effect. It behooves you to have faith, even if there is no God or God thing out there. And I think we're going to have to rediscover that. As Kent was talking about equinoxes and all these pagan holidays that have lasted for thousands of years, they're like part of our ancestral memory. They're actually inside of us. They're not external things. And as you go through your processes, many of you will go through individuation and such, you will rediscover those gods, if you will, the archetypes within yourself. And I think you will find that you are capable of incredible things, but in any event, you're going to have the opportunity to do without. And you should really start thinking about doing without now to prepare yourselves for that. And seriously, doing without. These shortages we see now are not temporary. They are the beginning of the Great Reset. And that is not something that the UN is trying to foist on us. That is something that is inevitable. It is just going to happen. Out of my own narcissism, I'm on this extremely high protein diet. I can only imagine the resources that have to go into what I eat in a week and what they could do if they were directed towards grains and whatnot to feed people in desperate lands. And yet I justify it to myself. And I think we're going to have a very hard time letting go of that. But from a civilizational perspective, we are at the cusp of the Fermi paradox, the idea that civilizations haven't contacted us because they don't exist anymore. They proved themselves unworthy to exist. They killed themselves off with war, climate change, the spoliation of the environment. And we are there now. This is our World War II, our Manhattan Project. And Nietzsche says that in doing away with oneself, one does the most esteemable thing possible. One thereby almost deserves to live. That sounds very cold. But what he's actually saying is you have to choose to live, and you have to have a life worth living. And it's a recurrent theme. And we're going to have to rediscover that and sort of dissociate ourselves from these intrinsic materialist, empiricist ways of thinking about the universe. And we will get the opportunity if we want it or not. That's the anxiety and despair.
Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Susan Hohenhaus. I'm the adjunct faculty advisor for the new healthcare management program here at Elmira College. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tact and give you a bit of a case study. So I am a registered nurse by background, but I'm also a disaster preparedness expert. So I spent the formative years of my career at the University of North Carolina as an emergency nurse, and then spent the next several years working as the director for emergency medical services for children throughout the entire state. So there are 100 states in North Carolina. And if you think about the impact of climate change, whether it improves significantly or does not over the next years, decades, centuries, we still have to look at how do we mitigate harm to our population on things that are probably going to be a little bit worse even in the short run. So I'm going to give you a little case study. Probably nobody in this room remembers Hurricane Floyd, but you may have heard about it in the last few years when we had some other significant hurricanes. So Hurricane Floyd hit Eastern North Carolina on September 15th of 1999. The importance of a learning culture that came out of Hurricane Floyd. So learning may start here, or it's been going on for a few years for all of you who are in an academic setting, but that lifelong learning cannot stop, because things that we didn't know during Hurricane Floyd, it was a 500-year flood. Nobody anticipated that. North Carolina gets hit with hurricanes all the time. So there was a lot of information and learning about how do you manage a hurricane. It was mostly storm surge at the coast. Nobody ever considered the rising waters of river flooding during that same time frame. So East Carolina University, which is attached to the healthcare facility, at the time was East Carolina Medical Center, now part of the Vidant Health System. That system is pretty much spread across all of the 40-some counties in Eastern North Carolina. So a third of the state was underwater. So picking up on the conversation around scarce resources and what you can use. So a few things that happened during Hurricane Floyd. East Carolina did not close its campus. The schools did not close their school until the water started to rise. So kids from elementary school, middle school, high school were sent home in the middle of the day when it started to look kind of bad, but their parents didn't get home to them before the water rose. So there was bifurcation of the cities and the towns that they couldn't get there. The East Carolina students then couldn't get home. They relocated everybody up to a little bit of a higher ground. It was actually where the dining hall was. They ran out of food pretty quickly. We had to get helicopters in there to be able to move those things around. So thinking about what that looks like for all of you on a campus or in a community, you can't get the state or the feds to you in time to be able to solve those problems. So what solutions can you think of that you might need to prepare for? So that learning culture over a period of time is really critical to understanding, how do I take what I learned from Hurricane Floyd and apply it later on to other things. So a couple of big examples there. So there was no flood mitigation planning, no mapping that happened at that time frame, no early alert networks. Those things exist now. There were very few professional disaster preparedness people in healthcare settings. So now in hospitals, you have, even here locally at the Guthrie system, all the hospitals have their own disaster preparedness specialists. And those people know how to deal with both planning, mitigating during the hurricane, and then learning from that from the disaster or the crisis afterwards. The other critical element of that was, so Brunswick Hospital lost its roof. Pitt Hospital, which is now Vidant Health, had no water, no running water at all for several days. They now have their own water system that taught other hospitals throughout states that they needed their own water system. We now close schools earlier. We send campus students home earlier if we can, or at least relocate to safer ground. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that the mitigation of healthcare and delivery of services. So you can imagine that most of those places couldn't provide any healthcare at all during that time. That didn't just happen in the day after. So there were 52 deaths. Most of them happened the day after the hurricane. Most of them were from drowning. 5 of them were from rescue workers. So now everybody's required to have personal flotation devices on their rigs. There are now 20 swiftwater rescue teams in that state that are a little bit different than they have been in the past. So think about that learning culture. Think about what you might be able to do if you were faced with a climate culture, and how you might prepare for that.
Hello, I'm Diane Davis. I am the Assistant Professor of Nursing here, and I have even yet a different story and scenario than all these folks here. I've been in healthcare as a nurse for 37 some odd years. Okay. So most of my time has been spent in emergency, in the critical care arena. So ICU and ER, but I've got to let you in on a secret. Okay. I'm going to be totally transparent to you today. I know very little about climate and how it affects health. So that's why I'm here. And I'm guessing that some of you are out there in the same boat. So we can learn together today. You might think, well, what, nurses, of course they're involved in, this type of thing. You talked about the floods. I was in the flood of 1972. And yeah, that was a long time ago, right? And, were you in there too?
I was one.
You were one. Oh, please, God, you're killing me. So my father lost, his dear friend in it. We were not prepared. We had never even had, any education or training or anything like this. We had no food, we had no power. We came together as neighborhoods, and that's where I really started my thought process on, how does this affect nursing? But just like you guys, you get busy with things, right? We get busy. I was busy with school and then, marriage and all that kind of thing. And then later on, back in 2019, I did graduate work, and I thought to myself, boy, I really have a weakened area really in public health. So I'm gonna do my capstone in public health, which is kind of crazy for me because I felt super comfortable in critical care, you know. Well, what I learned, I just want to share with you today. I learned that there's food insecurity right in this area. Can you imagine that? There's people in Elmira, in the next town over, and actually the town after that, that literally don't know where their next food is coming from, okay? So when we talk about this, you know, global warming and the rising of temperature, we should be concerned because already I was helping with the food justice program where we were getting volunteers on the weekends to come in after we cut some deals with, you know, farmers and grapes. This is the Finger Lakes. We have wonderful grapes here, you know? And so we, you know, we cut these deals where we could, you know, have some community volunteers that followed the rules of prompting. You know, we just couldn't have anybody in there and volunteer, do it right. And we could glean certain parts of the fields, you know, and then we could give that food, that fresh food that we really need to have to be, you know, healthy. So, you know, that's where it started. So that was, you know, I kind of ended that experience in 2019. And then what happened? You know, the pandemic happened, you know. So I was thinking I was going to get right out into education, but instead, you know, the pandemic occurred and, you know, I became involved in that and wanted to, you know, help out and that kind of thing. But then, you know, so now it's a couple of years later and I'm in education and I'm trying to get back to that area of my capstone regarding emergency preparedness, disaster, you know, food insecurity and those kinds of things. So I'm so thrilled to be part of this because I'm like some of you at the ground level where I'm just beginning to learn about the facts that, you know, this heat index that we've already seen heat-related illnesses, heat stroke, heat exhaustion, those types of things come into our ERs. Our ERs are full, right? What's going to happen when that temperature increases and we're going to have more of these situations? Heat brings on drought. What is drought going to do to those farmers or those little deals we got going on where we could have part of their crops? Okay, are they going to be able? Are they going to be able to be willing to forfeit that to help us, you know, meet the demands of food insecurity? Well, I will tell you that. Here's the good news. Nurses are a unique group of individuals. Okay, if you give us a certain job and you tell us what you want us to do, we're pretty good at getting it together and trying to help turn around these things, these public health, you know, things. So for instance, like when HIV first came out, that was pretty scary. And we had to train people to draw blood differently. We had to follow, you know, PPE that you see now, but that wasn't always like that. We learned it, and we learned it to the point where it became second nature. Okay, so we had some governmental regulatory, you know, processes going on that helped us keep on track for those kind of things. Well, you know, we are a workforce that comes in all shapes and all sizes, all colors, all races. Okay, we are out there everywhere. We're across the entire nation, and couldn't we just be a wonderful resource for, you know, addressing the situation that's going on now? I just want to tell you, nursing, they're one of the most trusted professions that we have. And that has been true of years and years and years. But sometimes I think we are a little of an untapped resource. We're good if you give us a certain, here's the deal. Here's what I want you to work on. So I'm encouraging you, if you are not a nurse, if you're in another realm, to come and get together with nurses. We should be working collaboratively so that nurses who are that trusted union that are nationwide can really make an impact in the effects that climate health has on health. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin Murphy. I am the Director of Counseling here at the college. I've been here since 2008. Those of you who know me, and there's a few of you, I tend to think very metaphorically, and I like a good story. So to kind of start my contribution to this, has anyone ever been sick and had a fever? Right. So back in 2018, December, I got what at the time I called apocalyptically sick. And guys are wusses when we're sick, so keep that in context. As I
He
share
said
this,
it.
I did. I own that. Over the course of 9 days, I got bronchitis, double pink eye, and double ear infections, right? So I'm laying there like, oh, I'm dying. And I had 101 fever, right? Nursing staff in the room, 98.6 is the normal, correct? So my fever was about 2.5 degrees higher than it typically is. And I felt like I was dying, right? This horrible headache, body aches, couldn't move very well, felt terrible, was nauseous, the bronchitis, the whole 9 yards. And something occurred to me during all of that woe and misery, right? Because just completely coincidentally, there had been some things in the news in the weeks leading up to that about climate change and, you know, anticipating a couple 2 to 3 degree change in overall global temperature. And you had your naysayers who were like, what's the big deal? It's just 2 to 3 degrees. And as I'm laying there with a 2.5 degree fever above normal and how awful I felt and how it's like, can I just die now instead of feeling like this? It's like, concept of parallel process. Parallel process is a concept to suggest that systems behave just like individuals. Systems in and of themselves are living things. The earth is a system. So if we feel as awful as we do with a 2.5 degree increase in temperature, what's the globe feeling? What's the planet feeling as a living thing unto itself, right? So 2 degrees, 3 degrees, people can argue not such a big deal, absolutely a big deal. The other parallel I draw, the other metaphor I draw from this, and I don't say this as a criticism, this is an opinion, it is an observation of my own. I think to a certain extent, the degree to which we are not taking care of the planet or not addressing our issues is very much in line with increasingly how much people aren't taking care of themselves at an individual level. Okay. Anyone in this room who's older than 30 can reflect back on the difference between when we were all your age, right? And there was different emphasis on self-care and addressing things in terms of skill building, things like that. That's changed and shifted for a variety of reasons. But the bottom line is, in my experience as a therapist, 26 years, I have seen a dramatic downward shift in the emphasis people spend on prioritizing their own well-being, taking care of themselves. And my point in emphasizing that is either from the vantage point of I plan to do nothing to address climate change, I feel powerless in the face of that. If you're aware of it, it's a threat. If it's a threat, it needs to be managed. The emotions need to be regulated. You have to make a decision on how you're going to frame that and address that. Even more so, if you are intending to do something about it, one, you have to be in an emotional position of strength because emotions undercut cognitive capacity, okay? Our nervous system is threat-based. It is wired to anticipate and identify and gravitate towards all the worst things we can possibly imagine. And here's the evidence of that. Show of hands, anyone in here by nature a worst-case scenario thinker? Right? Anyone pretty good at that, right? Your brain seems to take on a life of its own. That's your brain doing its job. And if you are a worst case scenario thinker, congratulations. You have an intelligent brain, you have a good nervous system. The challenge is we live in a culture that doesn't really teach us how to put a leash on that and make it work for us. So either in terms of just dealing with the stress and the threat and the implicit nature of what climate change is bringing to the table and the fact that there's such an emphasis on it, or if you are in fact planning to do something about it, it has to start at home, it has to start with you. Okay. And the good news is we have control over us and what we choose to do, right? So it's about putting ourselves in a position of strength. And it's 3 basic categories. The planning is very straightforward. The execution is another matter altogether because it compels people to have to do things different, go places that are uncomfortable. And the irony for us as a species, in my opinion, we are one of the, if not the most adaptable animals on the planet, but we do not like change because oftentimes change is not fully formed. It's not clearly stated. It's full of shades of gray. And we have learned, and the way our nervous system is built, we shy away from shades of gray and uncertainty. So how do we start creating certainty? Look at it from a very basic framework, physical, emotional, and cognitive. And they're sequenced very deliberately that way because as esoteric as emotions are, as intangible as stress is, right? Subjectively, we feel it, but it's a biological byproduct of our nervous system in action. So we have to manage it first and foremost physically. The chemicals that facilitate the human stress response do not have a reuptake process, do not void themselves spontaneously. They have to be released either through acute physical activity or through crime. Okay. And if you look at the physical activity piece, most people are, if they're honest with themselves, they're nowhere near as active as we ought to be, just from a regular health standpoint, let alone managing stress. So very basic strategy, increase your physical activity on a daily basis. I'm not suggesting go to the gym for an hour or run marathons, but incorporate at least 5 to 10 minutes of very rigorous exercise per day. And why 5 to 10 minutes? Fight or flight as a system is not intended to spend an hour running for our life or fighting for our life. It's quick, it's acute, it's 3, 4, or 5 minutes top of max effort, at the end of which we're either alive and safe or we're dead, right? So emulating that on a daily basis where you're beginning your day doing 5 minutes of really high energy just to burn off that stress and start your day with a clearer emotional feel. Second category, emotions, right? Show of hands, how many people are having fun on a regular basis, daily? How many people have things that they look forward to on a weekly basis? Right? Not a lot. Shamefully, sadly, not a lot. And that's not unusual. And what is the point of that? Okay. Our brain, unless we train it otherwise, does not differentiate thought from reality. And the evidence of that, anyone who ever believed in Santa Claus, tell me you did not have trouble falling asleep on Christmas Eve when you're a little kid, because you're so jacked up and excited because you're thinking about Santa and Christmas gifts, and your little kid brain didn't differentiate that reality from imagination. So you had the appropriate emotional response. Well, it works with everything else too. So if we're not engaging in regular activity that's enjoyable, if we don't have things to look forward to, if we don't have positive events that we immerse ourselves in, that we can reflect back on after they've happened, when we're starting to get pressed upon by the challenges of the day, then you can expect your brain's going to do its job and start looking for all those worst case scenarios. And having fun, as simplistic and cursory as it sounds, is a necessary remediating element. It's the antidote to worst case scenario thinking. Okay. And if you look at the World Health Organization's evaluation of countries and what countries are the happiest, it's typically, for the past 40 or 50 years, the Scandinavian nations are always jockeying for the top positions, top 3 to 5 positions. And it's a bit contraindicated, because anyone like winter? Anyone like 20 below zero and ice and all of that, right? Many people don't. We are bald apes, right? We're not really designed to live in cold climates, but in the Scandinavian nations, that's the land of like, hey, it's going to be dark for the next 90 days. And hey, it's like winter 8 months out of the year, but they're still some of the happiest people on earth. How? Because from the time they are born, they are indoctrinated with a cultural imperative that says, live in the moment, become a master of the moment. As long as you're fed and watered and have people around you feel safe with, as long as you're engaging with something that's enjoyable and stimulating, life is good. And because of that, they learn that they don't have to worry about tomorrow or next week or stress about things, because they become masters of the moment. And when you're a master of the moment, all next week is a moment that hasn't occurred yet. You don't really have to worry about it. So as simplistic as it is, having things on a consistent basis that shift the emotional landscape for you is an absolutely necessary thing. It's not going to happen on its own. We have to actively work on that. Physical and emotional or symptom management to set the cognitive, right? And there's been elements of this already identified in this panel. What we think matters, our focus matters. Our brain ultimately wants to have a plan for the threats that we're aware of. Most people in our culture, when they're stressed, when they're threatened by something, it's like, yeah, I'm going to put it over to the side and ignore it and just bottle it up. But when you live in a world where, in the interest of climate change, it's increasingly being focused on, you can't ignore it, and it's everywhere. No matter how much you bottle it up, not only is the society in which you're living going to bring it to the forefront, the reality is your brain's aware of it. It's going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. So you can either wage a civil war internally and keep pushing back and trying to bury things that want and need to be heard, or you can start taking a look at what are things I can start doing. Because the worst thing for an intelligent animal is to be faced with a threat that they either don't understand, don't conceptualize, or don't have a plan. So let's start talking about plans. What can you do at an individual level? What can you do to empower yourself? Because more than anything, we do not want to be in a situation where we're threatened without any recourse to do something about it. So when you put yourself in a position of emotional strength, when you manage things physically, when you clear your cognitive capacity enough to start planning, that's when you can start creating traction. And I'm not suggesting I have the answer. That's an individual pursuit for everyone in their own life to figure out, what can I do to contribute? What can I do to do my part, and recognize the limit and scope of what you can do? Because the other element that is so threatening to human beings is we can imagine and envision things far beyond our station. So when you create expectation that you can't meet, that gap in between expectation and reality, that in itself becomes an additional level of threat. So ensuring that whatever it is you're setting yourself to is viable, it's realistic, and you have the capacity to execute it, and have that be what you measure your progress and your sense of achievement off of, to create a completely different emotional state amidst all of this. So food for thought, if nothing else.
Now it's time for discussion. If there are any questions, stand up to the mic and ask a question.
Don't be shy. I think we were also asked to prepare some discussion questions. And if any of the panelists would like to throw out a question to maybe see if anyone has thoughts to share, and then please offer your own questions. My question that I thought of in advance, since I've been thinking about trying to shift from pessimism to optimism, trying to break down the challenges of tackling climate change into more manageable individual pieces, to try to piggyback on what Dr. Murphy was saying about setting reasonable expectations of what can I do as an individual that was going to add up cumulatively, collectively to so much more if we are doing things as a community, which is really a collection of individuals, each doing what makes sense for them, is what are the types of things that you see that you could do that you think others might be able to incorporate as a reasonable goal that adds to that impact? Or what are some of the things that give you hope where you see these opportunities to make progress? I like to look at all the new, electric cars that are being designed and think about how my next car purchase is going to be more environmentally friendly than my last car purchase. And that's something I could do that's pretty low effort because I can just look at, information. But I'm planning for an action that I think is going to have benefit. And always driving my most fuel efficient car of the two that we own. My wife doesn't have it.
Right.
Whoever's driving further gets that car for the day.
Right.
We've been addressing climate change up at our camp in the Adirondacks since Bill McKibben wrote his book, The End of Nature, back in 1989. We've been dealing with things. One of the things that we were able to put in was a composting toilet in the off of the dining room to use, and it saved about 3 million gallons of water so far. But the reason it's there, because I want some kid to go into the bathroom and realize that toilets don't have to flush. But there are other ways of seeing it. And I want her to go to a place like Elmira and study, become an engineer and design a composting toilet system for an apartment complex, and then game on. I see things all the time in your generation and the ones beneath you who are coming up with ideas that I would never have thought of. And our job as the old farts is to try to get you high enough on our shoulders so you can see things that we haven't seen yet, so that you can begin to develop those things like, what's the step after electric cars? Somebody's already with a crazy eye sitting in their dorm room trying to figure that out. So seeing those things come through give me a sense of hope.
Think about something simple. I'm kind of just a simple person, so I'm going to think about sunscreen. Okay, think about sunscreen for a minute. Sunscreen, we use it. Some of us might be going on a little vacation coming up. We might be thinking about the summer, that kind of thing. And before I really kind of began to really understand climate change and that kind of thing, I just used whatever sunscreen was on sale, gave the best tan. I'm just being real with you, right? Okay. But you know what? I did some research just in preparing for this, and I found out that there's several types of sunscreen that have these really, really harmful agents in it. Oxybenzone. Anybody heard of that? That's just one of the harmful agents. Okay. Think about this for a minute. So I'm just using myself as a nurse, but it could be you in your dorm, it could be you and your family, whatever. So nurses talk about sunscreen, believe it or not, in a lot of different platforms. We go to fairs. We talk about it in the public school system. We talk about it on campus. We go to health booths, maybe even something today. All kinds, inpatient, outpatient. Parents are coming in with their kids, and we're talking about those need to put that sunscreen on. Okay, so you might say, okay, nurses and yourself, we're kind of spread out in many different ways where we actually could make an impact on the choice of sunscreen, right? So think about that, and think about the fact that years ago we used to always use Bayer aspirin for pain relief. That's a long time ago, right? Every cupboard had Bayer aspirin. We didn't have Tylenol then, and we didn't have Advil. Okay. And so when it came out that, Rye syndrome was a real thing, and we really shouldn't be giving aspirin to people under 18 years old, the thought was, how are we ever going to get this Bayer aspirin out of people's cupboards, right? Because this is all we've done. This is all we know. But here's the funny thing. How many people use that for pain relief right now? We typically use Tylenol and ibuprofen or something like that, right? Because we were able to change the process of thinking. We had to change our thinking, right? So you do have an impact, right? Think about, does anybody here have an idea of how they could change one little thing, whether it be sunscreen or anything in their group? Think about it for a minute.
And I love that image that you just gave us of putting others on our shoulders. So learning from what happened in the past and how do you both prepare and innovate for the future? So the things that we've never thought about, preparing tactically for a flood event. So if you were on campus and had a flood event, so here was a bizarre thing that happened. So we had a lot of insect bites, things like that. So what's beyond tick-borne disease? What's beyond Zika disease? What are the things that could be happening in the future? Believe it or not, the increase in snake bites during flood was ridiculous. We had no concept of that, right? Because the floodwaters didn't recede for a long time. So people were out trying to move branches and everything. And they were being bitten by poisonous snakes. We didn't have antivenom. So now we know from, fast forward from Floyd, 20 years later to Hurricane Matthew, we knew all of those things. So we were prepared for that. But there are going to be things in the future that we never thought of. We never prepared for. That if you're standing on our shoulders and looking forward, that's going to be really critical to understanding, learning from the past, but innovating for the future.
I think for me, that's to build off of that. The most significant element of optimism for me is the fact that your generation and the generations a little bit before you, and I think certainly coming after you, actually care in a way that I don't think generations have preceded you have. And on that behalf, I apologize on all the old people for screwing you guys over and leaving you the mess that we have. And I say that sincerely. But as cliche as it is in my industry, you really do have to be aware of and acknowledge a problem before it can be addressed. And I think by virtue of your guys' generation and the focus and the emphasis that's been placed on it, and the fact that you all actually do stuff about it, right? I think you might be the most activism-based generation that I've seen in my lifetime. And what brings to mind for me is back when I was your age, the hole in the ozone layer was the big environmental concern. And nobody talked about it beyond the occasional acknowledgement in the news. It wasn't discussed in any of the science classes. Once upon a time, I was a science major. We never discussed any of that, let alone what to do about it, let alone how to handle the stress or the potential implications from a cultural societal standpoint. So the fact that things like this are happening, the fact that people show up, the fact that it's now part of the discussion at a cultural and societal level, I think that's a huge thing and a necessary starting point. So better days ahead.
Can I survey the group just a little bit? How many of you are 18 or over? How many of you are registered to vote? Anyone raise their hand for the first one, but not the second one? I won't make you raise your hand again, but if you did, there's something on your to-do list. How many of you are from New York State, residents of New York State? How many of you are out-of-state residents? Well, I got a few. So, okay, there, these things called elections that happen every once in a while, and different candidates may have a different emphasis about having initiatives related to climate change. And I really would encourage you. My first opportunity to vote was a presidential election that came up when I was in college, and that was on my radar. And I started trying to do some research to figure out which candidate I wanted to vote for. And that is a way that beyond your individual decisions in your day-to-day life, you can have an impact. Who do we want to elevate? If you're on our shoulders, we're the old fogies, and you can see ahead a longer view, toward the further horizon, who might be an old fogey is running for a position of power, and what is their vision? And is it a vision that really connects to a future for you, not just a short-term future for that person and what they foresee in their shorter continuing lifetime? So I would certainly encourage you to look for political candidates who have climate change as an initiative, specific goals of how to address it. Make that an issue. And if a candidate does not put that forward as a strong issue for them, I would encourage you to have second thoughts about what value forward is that candidate bringing in this. Only something you can have an impact on if you say, hey, when is the next election? Is there an election at the state level where you can vote, not just at the federal level, or state representatives who go to the federal level, or House representatives and senators and so on? So think about that.
All politics, all government are local. So don't just vote in the big elections. It's every time. And it's your local elections and all the people. You run yourselves. Get on the docket yourselves. Bring that perspective.
Right. Or take what you have, if you've learned anything today, if you take one thing from today, okay? Or maybe in preparation for today. And you take it back to your room, to your group, and you share it with somebody else. That's key. It doesn't have to be some huge, planned out thing. Just take back that idea. How do you think emergency preparedness started? It started with kitchen conversations. Okay, look what happened. We weren't ready for that. What are we going to do about that? That's where it happened. It moved from that point to garages and then to town halls. Okay, so I encourage you today to take any bit of what you've learned or heard about, ask more questions, do research, and then take it and have a conversation about it and keep the conversations going.
I have a question. So 2 points that kind of struck me were that you have to take care of yourself in order to take care of the earth, and that humans are resistant to change, kind of your area. How do you facilitate an environment where I would say that's normalized to not take care of yourself in this age and time? So how do you facilitate an environment where people feel the need to take care of themselves in order to take care of their environment?
So my perspective on that, it starts with the fundamentals of communication. So if I was to tell you how happy I am to be sitting here talking to you right now, there's nothing else I'd rather be doing. Do you believe me? No, of course not. And if I was genuinely acting like that, that would have an impact on the people in this room, directly or indirectly. Okay, so the breakdowns recognize that 70% of human communication is nonverbal and behavioral, 25% is tone of voice, 5% of the words that we use. So if you want to influence a group, a culture, a community, a society, a room of people, how you deport yourself, how you present yourself goes a long way. So towards that end, if you want to start creating shifts in how well people take care of themselves, be the model for that. Right? Do that, practice that, so people will observe and see the quality of life you create for yourself, because as resistant to change as we are, we're also very enviable, right? And there's something called relative satisfaction theory, that if we're aware someone in the environment has something better than us, it spurs a desire to have what they have or more, right? And anyone who went to middle school, you experience the hilariousness of that, right? Because that's why middle school is such a struggle. So the short version is back to Gandhi, be the change in the world that you want to see, right? Demonstrate, right, for people so they can emulate, talk about it, right, beyond the behavioral manifestation, talking about it, being direct. But that's the point where it goes back to acting at first, because if you don't have a credible platform, how are people ever going to buy what you're saying? So long way back to a short point, but really just living the lifestyle and letting people read that, if nothing else.
If I could follow on with something that you said about seeing others and feeling this sense of injustice that they have and we do not. Any one of us, even the most impoverished people in our society, in large part, live better than the royalty of previous centuries. They have indoor plumbing, they have heat, they have electricity, things that they would never dreamed of having back then. So it is a relative thing. And I know that I give a sense of doom, but there is an urgency, a black swan event that perhaps hasn't been considered, not just the crisis of the petrochemicals running out and the fact that we passed peak oil, but we have within us now all these microparticles of plastics and other things that are destabilizing the genome as well as the mitochondria. It's like the laws of thermodynamics. You can't win, can't break even, you can't get out of the game. We cannot stay as we are. The genome is destabilized. I don't know the solution, but I do know that you will find it, because I just have this unshakable faith that it's going to work out. You'll do the right thing. We'll do the right thing, along with a lot of wrong things. I don't know, if you can find out within yourselves, perhaps you can do more with it than I did.
One thing I would add is that we are terribly dismembered as individuals. I see a lot of you down on your phones, so I don't know if you're here or if you're there or wherever. So one of the things that, because I work in a place where we're separated from technology and the people I work with are separated technology, I find that when they're present in one place, they're healthier. If you can practice going out of here at some point during the day, just spend 2 minutes just being present, not trying to be somewhere else than where you are, and being aware that that sort of grounding, emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, can be incredibly life-giving.
I tend to make the parallel between natural resources that we worry about with regard to climate change and keeping the planet healthy, to use the metaphor of our attention as a limited resource. And if our attention is one place, it might not be that that is such a bad place to have our attention, but then our attention is not somewhere else where maybe it would be more beneficial to us to be in that moment. And to relate that back to your question about self-care, that we need to make sure we have moments in our day where we really connect with what's around us and look for opportunities for positive social exchange, get that physical activity that Dr. Murphy was talking about, to sort of complete the stress cycle. And that then allows us to prepare for actions and activities that are going to benefit others, and then allow us to be that example for someone else, to show that, well, now I'm ready to do things differently. Now I'm ready to challenge myself because I took care of myself first. And that can involve first getting centered on the moment, relieving some stress, and sometimes putting a device away and not letting it compete for that limited resource of your attention.
I want to add a observation that I think will resonate with many of you. Because I think you've had this experience, you likely have, and you'll have the back end too. So every August, when the freshmen arrive on campus and the president does the speech to the families and the new students, and they do the Elmira Hug, not uncommon that within a half hour, I have a line of 4 or 5 freshmen outside my door. Because the reality is their bodies are in Elmira, but their heads and their hearts are in a car driving back home with their family, or their heads and their hearts are with their friends somewhere else, or their girlfriend or boyfriend, right? So the whole concept of being present in the moment. If you need any evidence about how important and impactful it is, think back to when you came here. Or if there's any second semester seniors in the room, I oftentimes this time of year particularly get a line of seniors outside my door because they realize they're graduating. They're starting to think beyond graduation. So their body's here, but their head is at grad school or the job or the big unknown question mark that they haven't figured out yet. And they're terrified. And I don't use that word lightly. They're legitimately terrified because of the threat value that holds, that disconnect. They're not taking care of the moment, right? You identify a threat, you're not taking action to do it because you're split, you're dismembered, to use that term, which is a great term. Those to me are very, very profound examples of what it's like not to have your head and body in the same place. And imagine living like that every single day. And many of us do. And I don't think it's a coincidence then when you look at the uptick of anxiety, and stress, and substance abuse, and depression, and despondency, it's probably not a coincidence that we're seeing a correlation there. So
I feel like you're saying too, like from what you all have said, is that we need to think on those good things. It is good to think on those good things. And one way to do this, and I know this sounds really corny, but really is to say your thanks out loud. You don't have to be around a crowd of people or anything, but when you get up and you see that sunrise, like, wow, great sunrise, say it out loud. When we say it out loud, what are we doing? We're training our mind, right? Because that's kind of what we got to do. We got to retrain our mind a little bit in several different areas. So try to retrain your mind by thinking on positive things and actually saying them out loud. So your mind hears it and you can, dwell on that and reflect on that throughout the day.
On that note, can we give our panelists an round of applause? All right, so I'm doing this a little bit backwards. I realized I didn't introduce myself and someone asked me who are you. So, hi, I'm McKibben, 17. I am the assistant director of our Center for Excellence, Women Library. Come say hi. On another note, thank you for coming this morning to this set of panels. Looking ahead to the rest of the day, we have a low impact meal happening in the campus center through the lunch hour. We have another set of panels coming up at 1:15 around campus and various locations. If you see one of those posters that has a QR code, you can go ahead and scan that QR code and that'll tell you what's happening. We also have the Penn Library and Upcycle Flea Market. Go and check out some items that are available. Oh, and then at 6 p.m. tonight, right in this room, we have our plenary session with our campus leaders, President Lindsay and other leaders on campus will be here to discuss what climate solutions look like here at UC. So I highly encourage you to come back tonight and hear what they have to say. If you were unable to sign in when you got here earlier, I could make you sit down. You still have that sign-in sheet, and you're welcome to come up and do that now. Otherwise, thank you for attending, and let us know if you have any questions.
It's great to
Oh,
see
it's
you.
nice to meet you.